Hello folks, welcome to the third video for week 2 of MU111, where we're talking about harmonising Bach chorales. So this is building on everything we've talked about with music harmonies so far, from Roman numerals through to chord hierarchy to inversions, figured bass. Now we're talking a little bit about what at A-level standard is considered the sort of pinnacle of understanding of harmony. We're not going to go into as much detail. A-level courses might spend entire terms just on this subject. I'm just going to give you the basics. Obviously your task for this week is just around cadences, so lots of the things are done for you. I am going to give you a very quick overview of this though, so you have an idea of what the subject is, hopefully. So a chorale comes about in a cantata, a work for church music. Obviously J.S. Bach, our absolute boy, composed hundreds of these throughout the church year. The chorale is a piece for choir in between solo and instrumental pieces. They're normally to familiar tunes, so the congregation, the audience in the church, know the tune and the choir sing together. Crucially, all the melodies stay the same. Bach reharmonised different ones, and it's that aspect of reharmonising something, which is why chorales are such a useful example for thinking about harmony. Okay? So the examples I'm going to use in here are taken from Tom Pankhurst's website, which is a really useful resource. If you'd like to know more about this, I direct you there. I stress we're not going to be sort of assessing you purely on Bach harmonisation. I think it's just a useful case study for what we're talking about around harmony. Okay, so in a nutshell, let's look at this first example. Okay, this is a stereotypical chorale melody. It's just the top soprano line. It has a few phrases which end with pause marks. Those are where the cadences are. So for our step 1 of harmonising a chorale, we need to work out the key. So we talked about that last week, reading key signature and then thinking about chords. And then we need to consider our chord hierarchy once we've got that key. Okay, so with this first example, it's safe enough to assume that it's G major around those melody notes at the cadences. So it's not necessarily going to fit in with the relative minor, E minor. So our chord hierarchy then will have tonic, G major, primary of C and D as subdominant and dominant, and then secondary of other chords as well. We then need to work out cadences. That's step 2 for harmonising a chorale. So working out the cadences, in this diagram that Tom's put together, you can see working through options. Okay, that first phrase, in scale degree notation, that's going to be 3-2-1, B, A, G. The simplest cadence that would fit with that would be a PAC, a perfect authentic cadence like we talked last time, in G major. And indeed, Tom suggested that is the simplest one. Phrase 2, the cadence there, we could have modulated, we presumably have modulated, we've changed key at least. And for that, Tom's written up notation which suggests that we've moved to D major. Okay, it's clear enough that he said what key we're fitting in. Chorales don't necessarily change key, of course, they just have cadence in a different key. He's picked 2 potential options there for those cadences. Okay? From that, what you ought to be doing is going with the bass line then, because you're supposed to be filling in 3 other parts for a chorale harmonisation. So with just focusing on the bass line, we need to think about what's the simplest harmonisation we could come up with. That is using just primary chords, for instance. That's normally the simplest harmonisation in a major key. And for his example, Tom's come up with this, which moves very solidly around G. Everything's in root position, and it's simple enough. And then when it moves to suggest D major, we have a simple box, a pivot, which is a chord that is obviously in both keys but has a different function, and it moves very simply. Okay? So these are all primary chords within the keys that we're looking for. In this next level, we're looking at substitution. So I talked last time about substitutions. The easiest substitution might be a different inversion of the same chord. It could also be a secondary chord which contains notes of the primary chords. So the big example of that might be diminished 7, the 7 chord when it's diminished, which itself has notes of the dominant 7th. Okay? In this next level, we're not only trying to complicate and ornament things from primary chords into fingerprints, we're also trying to make everything a little bit more singable, so the bass line becomes a kind of melody. The kind of fingerprints here are language that Bach uses in his chorale, so that's why it's a good idea to listen really widely around these pieces. There's a YouTube link and there's a great IMSLP collection as well of these short pieces of music. So what makes a Bach bass line would be, still a singable melody. It still won't be these kind of block-like jumps. And also ornaments might be simple things like a suspension, a passing note, an anticipation. These are things that are very, very simple, but they provide melodic interest to a bass line. Okay? So we started to pencil in some of those as well. These are sort of simple substitutions just around the cadences. At this next level as well, we're starting to see what that bass line might look like. So we're seeing cadential fingerprints, we're then seeing inversions and passing notes to have a slightly more interesting bass line, and substitute chords as well. The next step from that is to fill in inner parts. Now you might think that that's straightforward enough, we obviously just need to complete the harmony, but there are rules about how these parts relate to each other. There shouldn't be a distance larger than, say, an octave between the alto and tenor parts, for instance. We shouldn't have large spaces in between them. We should have correct doublings in different inversions. So in root position, the root should be doubled as well on a different part, and that changes around. Other passing notes need to resolve in the same way, so a seventh has got to resolve downwards. We also shouldn't have parallels. This is often stated so much that it becomes a kind of joke, but parallel fifths are a real no-go in Bach. So Tom put together this really interesting wrong example, one that's got too many errors. If I look towards the final bar, the bass and tenor in the final three chords have parallel fifths. That's intervals of a fifth following each other, one after the other. And Bach would not do that. That's against the rules as Bach laid down. So crucially, we have to check through. This is the final result that Tom comes up with. Obviously, he's using the B system labelling rather than figured bass, but I hope it's good practice we'd be able to go through and change that ourselves. And that's the result of careful consideration, thinking about stylistic appropriateness, and then still things being interesting as well. That's the sort of step-by-step method for a Bach chorale, okay? And one of the final exercises of this week's tasks is for you to be harmonising just around cadences, okay? So it's just around stop patterns. Have a look at IMSLP for different examples. Bach is pretty reliable on these rules. I'll put a link to Tom's website as well for guidelines on Bach chorales. Of course, if you have any questions on those exercises, just drop me an email. That'll be fine. All right? Thanks very much, folks. See you soon.